October 1st, 1984. A cool, misty day in Dublin. The band stood in the shadow of Slane Castle, its stone walls towering, centuries old. Bono ran his hand through his hair, watching as Adam Clayton fiddled with the bass strings. The air was thick with anticipation, but none of them spoke about it. Not yet. What was there to say? They were about to release their fourth album, The Unforgettable Fire, and everything felt different this time. Larry Mullen Jr., U2's drummer, stood by the edge of the room, tapping his sticks against his leg, rhythmically, impatiently. "It doesn't feel like war, does it?" he finally muttered, half to himself. "No," Bono replied softly, looking out at the rolling Irish hills beyond the castle. "And that's the point." He wasn't wrong. War had been fierce, raw, a punch of protest and anger. But this was something else entirely. Bono's mind wandered to the album's title, inspired by an art exhibit about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. The devastation, the haunting aftermath, it stuck with him, weighed on him like a storm cloud, and he hoped the music would carry that same haunting resonance. Brian Eno and Danielle Lanois, the two producers they had brought in to shape the sound, had pushed the band in a new direction. It was no longer just about their iconic anthems or protest songs. The band's music had always been filled with heart, but now there was a new kind of depth. It was atmospheric, more introspective, less obvious. "People might not get it," Adam said, looking up from his bass, his voice uncharacteristically unsure. "Maybe," Bono replied, eyes narrowing in thought. "But if we keep playing it safe, they'll never know we're capable of more." And there it was, the real fear. The album was a leap into the unknown, but it was also a refusal to be boxed in. They had conquered war, sure, but that wasn't all they wanted to be. The music was evolving, and so were they. Edge sat in the corner, his guitar resting across his lap, hands calm despite the quiet chaos in the room. "What's it they say? If you don't change, you're already dead?" he said, half joking but not really. There was no going back now. The album had been recorded, the tracks mixed and mastered. This was the start of something new. The world they lived in wasn't simple. It was 1984, after all, a year marked by political tension, Cold Wars, and nuclear threats. The airwaves were buzzing with pop music, synth-heavy and neon-soaked. But U2 wasn't interested in following those trends. Instead, they'd drawn inspiration from the past and present, echoes of Cold War fear, art, and the influence of American civil rights leaders. It was a collection of moods and moments, threaded together by an overarching sense of humanity. By the time the first notes of The Unforgettable Fire would hit listeners' ears, it would be clear. This wasn't just another album. It was a journey into something deeper, something that stretched beyond protest anthems and political slogans. It was a testament to U2's evolution, both as musicians and as men standing on the edge of something bigger than themselves. Liam Gallagher slouched in his chair, sunglasses hiding his eyes from the dim studio light. Across the room, his brother Noel fiddled with his guitar, fingers drifting over strings like he was already miles ahead in some other world. The tension between them was palpable, as it had always been, but today it felt different. They were on the brink of something huge, even if neither of them would admit it outright. "You think people are ready for this one?" Liam asked, his voice thick with a mix of arrogance and curiosity. Noel didn't look up. He never did. Does it matter? It was October 2nd, 1995, and Oasis was about to release their second album, What's the Story? Morning Glory. The band had already tasted success with their debut, Definitely Maybe, a blistering record that had sent shockwaves through the British music scene. But this time, the stakes were higher. The Britpop war was in full swing, with Blur leading the charge on the other side. Oasis wasn't just releasing an album, they were making a statement. London in the mid-90s was buzzing. The grunge movement that had defined much of the early part of the decade was fizzling out, and in its place, Britpop had risen. The Gallagher brothers, with their northern swagger and unapologetic attitudes, were at the forefront of this cultural shift. It wasn't just about the music, it was about identity. Oasis represented the working-class grit of Manchester, a sharp contrast to the art school sensibilities of Blur. The British press ate it up, fueling the rivalry that only seemed to energize the Gallaghers further. But as much as the press loved the drama, there was more to the story. Morning Glory wasn't just an album of catchy tunes, it was an anthem for a generation. Tracks like Wonderwall and Don't Look Back in Anger would soon become sing-alongs for millions, not just in the UK, but around the world. The album's mix of raw emotion and melodic power spoke to young people navigating a world in flux. The 90s were a time of contradictions, hope mixed with cynicism, rebellion intertwined with introspection, and Oasis captured that perfectly. In the studio, as the final touches were added to the album, the weight of what was happening began to settle in. Noel's songwriting had matured, blending his love for the Beatles with his unique knack for making the personal feel universal. Liam's voice, raspy yet vulnerable, was the perfect vehicle for delivering those emotions. They didn't need to say it out loud, but both brothers knew this album would change everything. As Liam stood up, he shot his brother a look. "Just don't mess it up this time, yeah?" Noel smirked, but deep down, he knew the truth. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, and they were ready. It was a crisp fall morning in 1973, and Elton John had a glint in his eye. Something was different about today. He wasn't just another piano player in sunglasses and platform shoes. No, today was special. Somewhere in a smoky studio, the final touches were being added to a record that would forever alter the landscape of rock music. "Is this it, Bernie?" Elton asked, sliding his glasses up his nose as he stared down at the album cover, a whimsical painting that somehow captured everything and nothing all at once. Bernie Taupin, Elton's longtime lyricist and partner in crime, simply nodded. "Goodbye, Yellow Brick Road," Bernie murmured. "This is the one." Elton's seventh studio album wasn't just another record for the books. It was a turning point. By 1973, the world was in flux. The Vietnam War was dragging on. Political scandals were unraveling in Washington, and disco was starting to creep into the fringes of popular music. Amid all this, rock and roll had become more than just music. It was a statement, a way for people to express their frustration and their hopes. The era demanded more than simple love songs, and Elton John knew it. He wanted something bigger, bolder, something that would break free from the ordinary. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road wasn't just an album, it was an escape, a fantasy world for anyone who needed it. From the moment the first chords of Funeral for a Friend, Love Lies Bleeding echoed through speakers, it was clear this wasn't a conventional record. It was a sprawling, ambitious work of art, a double album no less, featuring everything from hard-hitting rock songs to intricate ballads, all laced with Bernie Taupin's vivid, often surreal lyrics. "Why Yellow Brick Road, though?" someone had asked Bernie during a press interview. Bernie had smiled, leaning back as if the answer were too obvious to explain. "The Wizard of Oz," he replied, "but also the idea of leaving behind the past, all the glamorous things that are supposed to bring you happiness. It's about getting away from all that, finding your own way." At its core, the album captured the disillusionment of the 1970s while also celebrating the art of storytelling. Tracks like Benny and the Jets gave fans the signature Elton flair, raucous and electrifying, while songs like Candle in the Wind touched hearts with their delicate simplicity. These weren't just songs, they were stories, painted in vivid colors by the duo of John and Toppin, and they resonated with anyone trying to navigate the confusion of the era. But it wasn't just the sound or the lyrics that made Goodbye Yellow Brick Road unforgettable. It was the way it all came together. In an age where artists were beginning to experiment with new sounds, production styles, and recording techniques, Elton and his band embraced the studio as an instrument itself. Layer upon layer of instrumentation gave each track a richness that was almost orchestral, yet the emotions never felt buried under the weight of the production. Every song hit exactly where it was supposed to. The album was an instant success, solidifying Elton John's place as one of rock's most flamboyant, yet deeply emotional figures. He wasn't just performing anymore. He was creating entire worlds, ones listeners could step into every time they dropped the needle on the vinyl. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road was a reflection of a time when music was more than a backdrop to life. It was life. As the last track spun to a close, Elton leaned back in his chair, gazing out the window at the world beyond the studio. "We did it, Bernie," he whispered, though it felt like a quiet understatement for something so monumental. And indeed, they had done it, not just for themselves, but for every listener who was ready to take that journey down the yellow brick road. It was 1977, and Berlin was like a scene out of a surreal painting. The Cold War had sliced the city in two, a brutal concrete wall standing as a reminder of the tensions simmering between East and West. In the middle of it all was David Bowie, slipping through the streets, not as a rock god, but as a man searching for something. His world had changed. Fleeing the chaos of fame and personal demons, he found solace in the divided city's strange energy. But little did he know, within the walls of a modest studio, he was about to create something timeless. Heroes wasn't just a song, it was an anthem of defiance, a cry of hope set against a backdrop of gloom. Bowie's collaborator, Brian Eno, always had a knack for the unconventional, and together they crafted something magnetic. "What if we take that sound and stretch it further?" Eno suggested one afternoon, peering over his iconic round glasses. Bowie smirked. "Why not? Let's make the future sing." Their studio, Hansa, sat only a stone's throw from the Berlin Wall. Every time Bowie looked out the window, he saw the brutal divide between East and West Germany, a reminder that some things could never be touched, no matter how close they appeared. It was here, in this strange, tense atmosphere, that the title track of the album Heroes came to life. Bowie's voice, cracking with raw emotion, was inspired by a simple yet powerful scene: two lovers kissing by the wall, risking everything just to be together for a fleeting moment. "Do you think they know?" Bowie had asked, watching the pair from the studio. Eno shrugged, fingers hovering over his synthesizer. "Does it matter? They're heroes, if only for a day." The album, released on October 14, 1977, wasn't just another rock record. It was a fusion of sound and emotion, a mix of krautrock, experimental electronics, and the aching soul of a man rediscovering himself. Bowie's fascination with Europe's divided spirit and his own internal battles poured into every note. The title track, in particular, stood tall, a beacon of hope that shone through a fog of despair, defying the gray walls and cold streets outside. Heroes cemented Bowie's place as more than a musician. He was a storyteller, a poet of the times, capturing the fractured world around him, and transforming it into something beautiful, haunting, and above all, human. In those cold Berlin nights, Bowie gave the world a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always a glimmer of something heroic waiting to be found. The holiday season of 1957 was shaping up to be unlike any other. As autumn leaves danced in the crisp air, a peculiar buzz filled the streets of Memphis, Tennessee. Fans huddled in groups, whispering excitedly about their beloved rock and roll sensation. Little did they know, Elvis Presley was about to unwrap a musical gift that would forever change the sound of Christmas. In a cozy recording studio, the king of rock and roll adjusted his iconic quiff and cleared his throat. "You ready for this, Colonel?" Elvis asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, nodded with a knowing grin. "Boy, you're about to make Santa jealous with those pipes of yours," he chuckled. Elvis's Christmas album wasn't just another record. It was a daring fusion of rock and roll energy and timeless holiday classics. The album featured tracks that would become instant favorites, like Blue Christmas and Santa, Bring My Baby Back to Me. But it wasn't all jingle bells and mistletoe. Elvis also included gospel songs, paying homage to his spiritual roots and showcasing the depth of his musical prowess. As the album hit the shelves on October 15, 1957, it sent shockwaves through the music industry. Some radio stations banned the album, claiming it was sacrilegious to mix rock and roll with sacred Christmas music. "Can you believe it?" a young fan exclaimed, pressing her ear against a shop window. "They're trying to silence Elvis. As if." Her friend nodded vigorously. "No way, man. You can't stop the king." Despite the controversy, or perhaps because of it, Elvis's Christmas album soared to the top of the Billboard charts. It became not only the best-selling Christmas album of 1957, but also one of the best-selling Christmas albums of all time. As families gathered around their record players that holiday season, Elvis's velvet voice filled living rooms across America, adding a new rhythm to cherished traditions. The album's success proved that Elvis could conquer any genre, cementing his status as a versatile artist and forever changing the landscape of holiday music. It was a chilly October evening in 1978, and the world of music was buzzing with a new kind of anticipation. Elton John, the flamboyant king of the stage, was about to release something different, a piece of his heart that didn't quite resemble the glittery, rock-fueled anthems that had shot him to superstardom. Whispers spread among fans. Would this album be the same Elton? Or was he showing the world a new side of himself? "Elton, are you sure about this?" Bernie Taupin asked, leaning against the studio door. He and Elton had been partners in songwriting magic for years, their lyrics and melodies inseparable. But this time, something had shifted. Elton, sitting at the piano, adjusted his round glasses and smiled. "I've never been more sure. This one's mine, Bernie." He gestured at the sheets of music in front of him. The papers seemed to hum with a quiet kind of defiance. "A Single Man," they read, the title of his 12th studio album. But for Elton, it was more than just a name. After years of collaborating with Taupin, this would be the first time Elton stood alone. No Bernie. Just Elton John, his piano, and a collection of songs that felt personal in ways the public hadn't seen before. The decision wasn't just about the music, though. It was 1978, a time when disco was king, punk was rising, and the world of rock had shifted. Elton felt the change in the air. He wasn't the same man he had been in the early 70s. He had stepped back from the wild lifestyle, toned down the extravagant outfits, and was beginning to explore a more introspective side of himself. In A Single Man, the songs echoed his journey, a quieter, more reflective tone. Tracks like Song for Guy, dedicated to a young messenger who had died unexpectedly, revealed an Elton that was grappling with mortality, loss, and change. This was a different flavor from the colorful hits like Rocket Man or Crocodile Rock. But it wasn't without its own power. As the album hit the shelves on October 16th, 1978, critics and fans alike were caught off guard. Some wondered if Elton had lost his edge, while others admired the raw honesty. But for Elton, it wasn't about the praise or the charts. He had something to say, and he said it his way. The album might not have been drenched in the same glitter that marked his earlier work, but it shone just as bright, perhaps even brighter, for those willing to listen closely. London, 1973. The air was electric. David Bowie, clad in his striking flame-red mullet, strutted through the city streets like a man possessed. He had just returned from conquering the world as Ziggy Stardust, the alien rock star who'd mesmerized the world. But Bowie wasn't looking to stay in the stars. No, he had his eyes set on something closer to home. The music that made him. "Do you think they'll get it?" Bowie asked, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a dimly lit studio. His ever-present cigarette dangled from his lips, and his fingers danced idly on the floor. Across from him sat Ken Scott, his trusted producer, who, with a knowing smile, replied, "They're going to love it, David. You're paying homage to the songs that shaped you." Homage was the word. Bowie's seventh studio album, Pinups, wasn't the glam spectacle fans might have expected. Instead, it was a love letter to the 1960s British rock scene, an era Bowie had come of age in. He'd grown up on these songs, hanging around London's smoky clubs, wide-eyed and soaking in the sounds of bands like The Who, The Yardbirds, Pink Floyd, and The Kinks. Now, fresh off his intergalactic success, Bowie was ready to return to Earth. And what better way than to cover the songs of his youth? But this wasn't just some nostalgic trip. It was 1973, after all, a time of upheaval, both musically and socially. The glittering promise of the 60s had given way to a grittier, more cynical 70s, and Bowie, always the chameleon, was reflecting that change. He wasn't interested in simply rehashing the past. No, in true Bowie fashion, Pinups was a transformation, a reimagining of classic hits, twisted and distorted through the lens of his signature glam rock style. "Let's give them something familiar, but make it Bowie," he said, as he scrawled notes onto a napkin, brainstorming song arrangements that would elevate these classic tracks. And that's exactly what he did. Bowie wasn't interested in carbon copy covers. He wanted to turn the music that had shaped him into something new, something reflective of his current sound. This was a bold move. Here was a rock star at the height of his powers, turning his gaze backward instead of forward. But only Bowie could make the old sound this fresh. By the time the album was ready to hit the shelves, Bowie's fans were in for a surprise. It wasn't Ziggy. It wasn't Space Oddity. It was Bowie unmasked, celebrating the music that made him who he was. And though some critics scratched their heads, wondering why Bowie had chosen this moment to step away from his otherworldly persona, there was something deeply human about Pinups, something grounding. David had, after all, never been one to follow the rules. It was a crisp autumn day in 2003, and London's Camden streets buzzed with an air of defiance. Somewhere in the heart of it all, Amy Winehouse, with her signature beehive and fierce eyeliner, was about to send ripples through the music world. At just 20 years old, she was no stranger to the stage. But today was different. Today, she was on the brink of releasing her debut album, Frank, a record that would challenge conventions and set her apart from the polished, pop-driven landscape of the early 2000s. Yet, this was no overnight sensation story. This album had something raw, something real, that would catch everyone off guard. Amy, do you ever think people will actually get this? Her producer, Salam Rami, asked as they sat in the studio, finalizing the last tracks. Amy, never one to second guess herself, leaned back in her chair, a cigarette dangling from her lips. Get it? They're gonna feel it, mate. Whether they like it or not, they'll know it's real. And that's exactly what Amy brought to the table. In an era of manufactured pop stars, her authenticity was both a breath of fresh air and a sharp sting to the industry's polished image. She wasn't there to conform, she was there to make you listen, and listen hard. Born in Southgate, Amy's childhood was a tapestry of jazz records and family sing-alongs. Her father, Mitch Winehouse, filled their home with the sounds of Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, and Tony Bennett. It wasn't long before young Amy, with her rebellious streak and an old soul's musical taste, became infatuated with jazz legends like Sarah Vaughan and Dinah Washington. This love for the classics poured into every track of Frank. But Amy wasn't just paying homage. She was infusing her own life, her own messiness, into every lyric. By the time Frank was ready for release, she had written every song herself, a rarity for young artists at the time. The world Amy was about to step into was anything but welcoming. The early 2000s were dominated by sugar-coated pop stars, from Britney Spears to Christina Aguilera, all carefully curated and marketable. But Amy wasn't marketable. She wasn't playing by the rules, and that made her a risk. Yet, that risk was also her strength. When Frank hit the shelves on October 20th, 2003, it was immediately clear that this was something new. Amy's voice carried the weight of experience. Her lyrics spoke of heartbreak, disillusionment, and personal reflection, wrapped in a sound that was both old-school jazz and refreshingly modern. Tracks like Stronger Than Me put Amy's biting wit on full display, as she challenged the idea of traditional gender roles with the line, "You should be stronger than me." It wasn't just a love song, it was a statement. She took the vulnerability that came with young love and frustration and turned it into something powerful. Frank became an anthem for those who felt out of place, for the ones who didn't fit into the neatly packaged expectations of society. And yet, there was humor woven into her words, sharp, self-deprecating, and filled with the kind of honesty that was impossible to fake. The critics, at first, didn't quite know how to handle Amy. Her sound didn't fit neatly into any genre box. Was it jazz? Was it R&B? Soul? But that confusion only added to her mystique. The album wasn't a massive commercial success at first, but it started a conversation, one that would grow louder and louder. With Frank, Amy Winehouse made it clear. She wasn't here to follow anyone else's path. She was carving out her own, one brutally honest song at a time. And though this album would later be overshadowed by her even more iconic follow-up, Back to Black, it was Frank that introduced the world to a voice that couldn't be ignored. As the album settled into the public consciousness, Amy became more than just a singer. She became a symbol of authenticity in an industry often criticized for its artifice. With Frank, she reminded everyone that music wasn't just about being catchy or marketable. It was about feeling something real, something raw. This was only the beginning of Amy's story, a story that would burn fast and bright. But Frank was the spark that lit the flame. Taylor sat at her piano, staring down at the keys. Her fingers hovered just above them, not touching, just waiting, like the notes in her head that had yet to become real. Something felt different this time. The familiar ache of heartbreak swirled inside her. But it wasn't just personal this time. It was universal, bigger than her. As she glanced at the notebook beside her, filled with half-written lyrics and ink-smudged feelings, she knew it was time. The words in that notebook weren't just hers anymore. They were for everyone who had ever felt the sharp sting of love lost. This album would be different. Red Album was born, a bold, raw, and emotional masterpiece, released on October 22nd, 2012. But it wasn't just another album in Taylor Swift's growing discography. This was a turning point. Taylor had already conquered country music, but now she had one foot in pop and wasn't afraid to admit it. A friend once told her, "It's like you're painting with more colors now, not just the safe ones." And that's exactly what Red felt like. A messy, beautiful splash of colors on a blank canvas, where pop and country bled into one another in a way no one expected. Taylor wasn't trying to fit into any box, and that's what made Red so unforgettable. The music world was shifting, and Taylor was leading the charge. Artists weren't tied to one genre anymore, and Red felt like an anthem for that change. When she sat with her producers and they played the first few tracks, one of them asked, "Do you think people will get it? The mix of sounds?" Taylor smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. "They'll feel it. Even if they don't get it right away, they'll feel it." And feel it, they did. From heart-wrenching ballads to upbeat, playful tunes, Red was an emotional roller coaster, and fans held on tight for every twist and turn. But beyond the music, Red was also a reflection of the time. The world in 2012 was complicated, just like Taylor's lyrics. Social media was exploding, and fans were more connected to their idols than ever before. Everyone had opinions, and they weren't shy about sharing them. Taylor was no stranger to that scrutiny. As one of the most talked about women in the world, every lyric, every note, was analyzed under a microscope. But she didn't back down. With Red, she laid everything bare. Her heartbreaks, her hopes, her regrets, and in doing so, made millions feel less alone in theirs. By the time the album dropped, Taylor had already gone from country sweetheart to global sensation. But Red showed a different side of her, a more mature, introspective artist willing to take risks. And while some people might have thought she was losing her country roots, Taylor was simply expanding her reach. In the end, Red wasn't just an album about love or heartbreak. It was an album about growth, about realizing that no matter how many times you fall, there's always a chance to rise again. Just like the bright color itself, red was a symbol of passion, pain, and the fiery resilience it takes to live through both. Robbie Williams stood on the edge of a cliff, metaphorically, of course, facing an uncertain future. It was 2005, and he was about to release his sixth studio album, Intensive Care. He had already conquered the world as a member of Take That and as a solo artist, but now, something felt different. Success wasn't the question. The real battle was internal. He had been here before, fighting demons, struggling with the pressures of fame, and trying to make sense of his place in the world. But this album, this one had his heart, and it wasn't just about the music. It was about healing, reflection, and reclaiming his voice. As Robbie sat in the studio with Stephen Duffy, his collaborator on this deeply personal project, the mood was contemplative. Duffy looked over the soundboard and smirked. "So, how are you feeling about this one? It's not every day you bare your soul, you know." Robbie leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "It's intense," he admitted. "There's a lot of me in here, probably more than anyone's ready for. But that's the point, isn't it?" That was the core of Intensive Care. It wasn't just another pop album with catchy hooks. It was a journal set to music, a deep dive into Robbie's psyche, his highs, his lows, and everything in between. This wasn't the cheeky, cocky Robbie from the Angels days. He was older, maybe a little wiser, and certainly more self-aware. By 2005, Robbie had been through the ringer, public scrutiny, personal battles, and the weight of expectations that had threatened to crush him more than once. The album's creation process reflected this. While recording in his home in Los Angeles, Robbie had stepped away from the bright lights of England's tabloids and found solace in the calm of the California sun. Here, in the quiet, he and Duffy crafted songs that explored everything from his struggles with addiction to his quest for inner peace. It wasn't just therapeutic for Robbie, it was transformative. He needed this album as much as his fans did. But why now? Why 2005? By this point, Robbie had navigated the ups and downs of his solo career, standing tall despite the challenges that came with his meteoric rise in the late 90s and early 2000s. The world was watching, curious to see what a solo Robbie would look like after so much had changed. Intensive care was his answer. It wasn't an attempt to dominate the charts again, though of course that would happen anyway. It was a statement of survival, of resilience, and ultimately of hope. As the release date approached on October 24th, 2005, the tension was palpable. Robbie, ever the showman, had his doubts, but was ready to lay it all on the line. Duffy handed him a cup of coffee and grinned. "Ready for the world to hear what's been going on inside that head of yours?" Robbie smiled back, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Oh, they have no idea what's coming." And with that, intensive care was unleashed, raw, honest, and unapologetically Robbie.